welcome. Welcome to those that are here in presence and to those that are joining us online. So we are live streamed. Be careful about what you say. Okay, my name is Enrico Borghetto, and I teach here at the University of Florence. I teach political science and European studies, and I'm also the host for this seminar today. It's a new appointment of our ValEUs Lecture series. And I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished guest speaker today, Professor Hans-Jörg Trenz. He's a professor of sociology of culture and communication studies at the Scuola Normale Superlore. He's a leading scholar in democratic values, political communication, and European integration. And his research explores the evolving challenges to democracies in Europe today. So today, he will make a presentation entitled Enhanced Value Conflicts in Europe, Contestation of Democracy or Contestation Within and Across Democracies. Question: examining the tension shaping democratic values, the risk of democratic backsliding, and the broader implications for European societies. So, Hans-Jörg, thank you for coming here. So we agreed on a 50 minutes presentation, then there will be time for questions from the floor. So write down your questions and be ready to take up the mic when the time comes, okay? So in the meanwhile, please join me in welcoming Professor Trenz. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for hosting me here at University of Florence. It's not my first time that I talk here, but that was probably another generation of students 2 years ago. I think was the last time that you invited me louder for a lecture. It's always a pleasure to come over from Scuola Normale. You know that we have our faculty of political science in Florence, not in Pisa. We are in Palazzo Strozzi. So we are actually neighbors. We also collaborate in a joint master program. And I see that some of the students of our joint master program are also present in the room. So welcome to everybody here. It's a pleasure also to talk to such a large audience. Usually at Scuola Normale we have small classes. So I will use this opportunity also today to discuss with you. I'm not sure whether I will need the 50 minutes for my presentation. I would rather like to enter a debate with you. I guess that most of you are Italian students, but I assume there are some Erasmus. Are there some Erasmus here?
Yeah, we've got many Erasmus.
I can see this, yes. Yes. And that makes, of course, the class much more interesting if you have students from different backgrounds that can contribute also with different perspective to such an important topic, which is the Europe of values. And here I think my lecture is also part of a lecture series that is organized by Laura Leonardi on the Europe of values, which is part of your Erasmus Plus project. We had a lecture yesterday by Tim Beichelt on Germany. And today I would like to link a little bit my talk to a project that I was coordinating, which was also on value conflicts in Europe. That was funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. We collaborated with Juan Díaz Medrano in Madrid, in Spain, and with University of Flensburg in Germany, and myself here in Florence. We conducted 4 years research on how values, European values, European fundamental values are contested through the media, in particular through the social media. We looked at gender equality, we looked at freedom of speech, and we looked at the rule of law conflicts. That is a project that is finished. I'm not going today to kind of present research findings, how you present a research paper at a conference. I would rather like to give you the more general background of the topic, the relevance of the topic, which is this idea that in Europe we are facing enhanced conflicts about values, that so-called European values were kind of consensual before. Maybe we can discuss this whether they ever were consensual, but the idea is that they become more and more conflictive, that there are political parties, also electorates that change the meaning and of values in fundamental ways. And this comes in a way, yeah, I would say as a surprise for people like me, from my generation, who grew up with the idea of specific Western values that apply to us, that unite us, values that unite us and as Europeans, and that also build a kind of alliance with the US and with America. And these values were for a long time taken for granted. You find them written in our constitutions. This is what we educate in schools, at our universities. We also socialize as citizens with these values. And these values are institutionalized in many ways. For instance, how a media system is established. So we cannot imagine the West and democracy, actually, without such an assumption that there is such a common base of values that is shared by the citizens. So we do not want to have much conflict or drama around these core fundamental values. We want certainty. Now, if you think what we witnessed, I would say already over the last years, but in particular since the beginning of this year, from that perspective of a value consensus, is quite dramatic. It is dramatic because we never could imagine such a scenario that the West is over, as you read it now in the newspaper, that we have a new enemy, which are the US. That would be unthinkable only some weeks ago, and it would have seemed like a bad plot of a kind of dark science fiction story. Now, on the other hand, the idea that we need to defend our Western values is, of course, not new. As a matter of fact, as the West, we have grown up not only with the idea of a consensus of democratic values, we also grew up with the idea that we need to defend these values externally. And this is precisely the idea of NATO. So NATO is a military alliance that was set up with the explicit aim to defend values, to defend democratic values. This is underlying the logic of NATO as a Western military alliance of defense of values. And you could argue that this worked also well when the enemies were external, such as the Soviet Union during the Cold War, maybe also with Putin, Russia. This still worked to some extent. But it has become, over time, increasingly difficult to draw a clear line here between what we call our values and the external threats. So the idea that we need to defend our values is actually not new. But what is new, that it no longer works if you face kind of hybrid threats, if there is no longer a clear distinction between external and internal, and if it becomes increasingly blurred what actually is to be defended here. What does it mean? What is the very meaning of defending our values? And I think the war in Ukraine in particular, also other events, we could also include Gaza here, that makes us rethink whether the idea of a defense of values still works actually, and the idea that the defense of values leads also to a strengthening of these values becomes questionable. And this is what we have witnessed over the last years, and most dramatically in the last weeks, actually, that it is no longer taken for granted what are the kind of threat scenarios that we are facing here when we claim that we defend our community of values. And you could ask whether such a threat scenario was ever convincing. So it is, of course, also questionable from a historical perspective whether such an aggressive Russian ethno-nationalism that is fundamentally opposed to our Western values was ever kind of convincing a narrative. And I have myself, for instance, always argued that such a scenario is rather scaremongering. But today, this becomes more dramatic because it is no longer that easy to dismiss the possibility, for instance, of Russian aggression against NATO after we witnessed the last week Zelensky-Trump Vance exchanges in the White House. And I could maybe start with a brainstorming with you, a kind of brainstorming exercise for this seminar on European values, and imagine how then a new world order, I understand that also the topic of this class here is Europe in a changing world order. So maybe this brainstorming exercise could also be part of the discussion later. So take some notes now and come back later with questions. But how would this look like? A new world order that is dominated by a kind of US-Russia alliance against Europe. What would be the place then of Europe between the US and Russia, between two authoritarian states? Who would be potential allies and enemies in such a situation? And if you take, for instance, Trump, who has declared that he would take control of Greenland, Panama, Canada, other states in South America, then it would be also plausible to assume that Russia expands further, that it takes control over Moldova, Georgia, maybe also invade the Baltic states. We can no longer simply dismiss such scenarios as scaremongering, as we did only 1 month ago. And Trump and Putin might even be plotting a secret deal to make such a scenario happen. So what can Europe do then? Can heavy investments in the military be a solution? Or must we submit to the New World Order or the New World Disorder as Europeans? Can we invest in diplomacy in credible ways as Europeans? How could diplomacy look like in such a situation of uncertainty? What would be alternative forms of resistance that could maintain peace and justice? And how likely is it also that European voters will continue to favor leaders within Europe who are prepared to defend what we call European values? So would European voters, for instance, support their governments if they now start investing heavily in military expenses? Would this be viable? Would voters support this? Would European voters be willing to carry the financial burden of rearmament? Or would Europe not be deeply divided by such decisions? I know from talking with colleagues in Scandinavia or in Poland, where it is completely consensual that we should rearm. You would easily find a majority in elections with such a plan. I know for sure that in Italy, this would be much more controversial. I also know for sure that this would be extremely controversial in Germany and probably also in France. So can Macron and Merz, if they decide to invest now in rearmament, survive? Can their governments survive possible resistances they will meet domestically? Would a victory of Le Pen in France and AfD in Germany not become almost automatic if we invest in rearmament now? So these are fundamental questions that sound very dramatic. I would not have posed these questions 1 month ago, but I think they need to be addressed now when we talk about the defense of what we call a European community of values. And if we think that European values cannot be defended by military force, how can we support European values in a civic way? So here, in Italy, you have this interesting case of Michele Serra. The Italians probably know what I'm talking about, who came up with an appeal in La Repubblica last week for a united Europe of values, and he calls for a major gathering in Rome on the 15th of March. I can read his statement here in Italian. Trump sta accelerando lo scombussolamento degli assetti mondiali e uno smarrimento comune europeo. L'Europa o si fa o siamo fregati. In una piazza ti senti di appartenere a una comunità. Per questo mi rivolgo ugualmente a progressisti e conservatori. Non siamo abituati a pensare agli USA come a una possibile antagonista. Ma dobbiamo prendere atto di quello che sta accadendo. Un way of life europeo fondato su democrazia e diritti esiste e le armi politiche e culturali non ci mancano. Facciamo valere. So this is exactly a call for a European community of values, but it is not clear at all how he wants to defend this European community of values. He asked for a gathering in the streets, occupare la piazza. This is a typical Italian way to respond. And I'm not sure how successful this will be, because what exactly does it mean that Europe stands for its values? What does he mean by defending it? So does he promote here military investment or not? This has not become clear in his statement. And how also the defense of values relates to the security interests of Europe remains unclear. And I would guess that more people would protest in the piazza if someone calls for a march against rearmament, for instance. So if we want to discuss these future scenarios, we need to take a step back here, and we need to approach the idea of a Europe of values. And we also need to do this. I am a political sociologist and a cultural sociologist, so I think this is a useful perspective to think about a European community of values. And this is what I want to do now in the next half an hour. And to help us understand a little bit what is actually at stake here and what are possible scenarios. So if we talk about these so-called European fundamental values, what do we mean? You will hear me in the following talk a lot about values, European values, democratic values, but what is it? How can it be defined? And here it is clear that we do not talk about values in substantialist terms, in a kind of culturalist understanding of values, but we talk of values from a universalist perspective with reference to what we call rights, basic rights that underlie our democracies. And this could be freedom of speech, gender equality, rule of law. And these rights promote values like individual liberties, equality, justice. And this is precisely what Article 2 does here in the treaties of the European Union. So what they do here is to define values in a kind of universalistic way. You cannot say that these values only apply to Europe. You can only defend these values in universalistic terms, that they are the founding values if you want to establish a democracy that is based on principle of individual liberties, equality, fairness, and justice. And if you look then how these democratic values are kind of further institutionalized, how they are realized, what you will most likely end up with is a scenario of conflict. So the meaning of these values is contested. The way these values apply to particular groups of people, how they are expanded or restricted in particular contexts is always contested. So we also live here with the reality of conflicts about values. These values are defined to be also contested. And contestation of these values is part of the game when you live in a democracy. So another problem here of our European understanding of values is that we always define values in progressive terms. Progression means here that we assumed that values are not something of the past, but they are projected towards the future. We all agree that we do not live in a just and equal society, but we agree that equality and justice are values that should kind of bind us together in future planning of what our political community aims at. So the values then are used as a kind of critical template. And our perspective is always future-looking. We do not want to defend values of the past. We want to promote values for a better future. This is the European way of thinking about values. So European values then are meant to be a driver of progressive democratic politics. And they are meant to be inclusive. And this is a strange way of value community, you could call it, because precisely it is forward-looking and not backward-looking. And it does not define its identity by reference to the past, but by looking at the future. So it's the promotion of democracy and the inclusion of citizenship and rights that defines us as Europeans. So from that perspective, European values are seen as a driver of modernization, you could call it. And modernization here means also democratization. It's the idea that rights can be expanded, that this is an open-ended and inconclusive process. And this is, I think, also a core idea of the idea of European integration. So when we talk about European integration, we assume such a progressive understanding of values. That this is an interesting experiment, also from a sociological perspective, because it's the experiment of community and polity building with a future outlook. So that Europe applies this idea of an expansive community of values to itself. The underlying idea is that the nation-state framework is insufficient, that we need to think in broader terms when we want to expand this community of values. And this means then, this adds a third term to this progressive understanding. First, we said it's modernization, it's democratization, but now it's also Europeanization. So also Europeanization means here a progressive expansion of values, and this should include institutions, the institutions that were set up within the framework of the European Union, and also citizens. This is the very idea of European citizenship, which also is meant to be expansive. So also Europeanization here implicitly means democratization. So by granting EU citizenship rights, individuals then should socialize into this European community of values that is projected towards the future. So this is really an interesting experiment because it actually puts at test whether value progression works. And this would be also something for the discussion, whether there is evidence for success or evidence for failure of this experiment of community and polity building through this expansive logic of values. Now, As sociologists, as political scientists, we need to have some indicators for measuring this, whether such an experiment can be successful or not. And we can probably agree that it is difficult to find such indicators, especially because democratization is always something that is ongoing. The argument can always be, of course, there is no equality now, but it is something that is a kind of utopia that guides our present kind of interactions. So even if we can agree that the European Union is not a political system that shares the attributes of a democracy, we can still maintain this kind of progressive and expansive idea of expansion. And even if a state within the EU violates rules of democratic procedures, we can say that self-corrective mechanisms apply if we uphold this idea. And what we do then in general as political scientists and also in sociology, we do not measure the success of this idea, but we measure the failure. So what we do is we have lots of indicators for democratic deficits. We do not have that many indicators for democratic success, but we know perfectly the indicators when democracies fail. This is measured by there are several measurements for this within political science. And the question of democratic deficits then is related to the violation of core democratic principles and also of performance of states. So we have indicators for this. And this is the question of democratic backsliding. So what we do, and there's a growing literature on this, we measure how democratic backsliding takes place, what are the manifestations of it. And democratic backsliding then is defined as a form of value regression. So if democratization is defined as value progression, democratic backsliding becomes a form of value regression. And indicators for this, I do not go into detail here, but what you find in the literature is, for instance, electoral success of far-right parties, the victory of right-wing populism, anti-Europeanism, anti-liberal parties, the performance of elections, election indicators, for instance, with regard to the recent European parliamentary elections. We have done some studies as part of my project on the European value conflicts, where we observe radicalizations and polarizations between political parties, between countries, and also between electorates. So we also link the idea of value regression to the manifestations of enhanced conflicts about values. And in the literature, this is again framed in quite dramatic terms, in terms that our age of democracy is over, that we are entering the new age of post-democracy. And here again, we can ask, what does it mean? Post-democracy, if you look at the literature, it does not necessarily mean the end of democracy. It is not about a sudden rupture or a change of the system, but it is a more incremental process. It's a gradual change that happens within democracies. So the post-democratic transition is affecting existing democracies, their institutions, and also their practices. And Again, it's a question of what empirical evidence can be found for this, and also how plausible is actually such an assumption that we witness a transition from democracy to post-democracy. And is it possible at all? Discussing these broad topics of a transformation of our contemporary democracies, then many authors have explored changing landscapes of media, of public communication. They have looked at disruptive ways citizens or social groups make use of new digital, of new social media in democratic politics. And the question still remains, post-democracy as a plausible future scenario. How can we actually then conceptualize such a transition from existing democracies to future post-democracies? And here I have three possible scenarios for you, three different accounts of a post-democratic transition of society. The first would be that post-democracy is really perceived as a new type of political order. So this would mean that it could consolidate as a political regime that claims a type of legitimacy that is not founded in democratic values. So it would mean that our existing democratic values are no longer a kind of legitimizing or have lost the legitimating power for a political regime. It would also mean that there is a political regime, that there is an authority that can claim legitimacy that is not democratic. Now, if you think about this, actually not much comes to our mind. So what is an alternative legitimacy? Or put it another way, how can an authoritarian political leader claim legitimacy that is not democratic? I don't have a solution for this myself. We can look at existing regimes. We can look at China, this Chinese style of authoritarianism, which certainly challenges the idea of liberal democracy. It challenges values such as individual freedom, the rule of law. But it still maintains common good references, and it has institutions that claim for popular sovereignty, that claim to represent popular sovereignty. So I would say it is not a fully alternative to democratic legitimacy. It relies on relicts of democratic legitimacy in the way it claims sovereignty, in the way it claims legitimacy. This is even more clear in the case of Russian ethno-nationalism, or however you would call this. There are clear references to popular sovereignty. There are democratic institutions in place. There are democratic procedures in place, even though we know that it is deficient in many ways. But I would not go that far and call it an alternative type of political order that successfully claims legitimacy that is not based on democratic values. We can discuss this later, whether you disagree with this or not. So as a matter of fact, no regime comes to my mind. We could maybe discuss the idea of a theocratic regime. like Iran might come close to this. But these are the only cases that come in my mind. The second scenario here of how such a transition of from democracy to post-democracy can be imagined is the idea of post-democracy as what I call here democratic fatigue. So here, democracy would simply no longer be on the agenda. It would not disappear. The democratic constitution would still exist. The democratic setup of a state would still be in place, but people would no longer care about democracy. So this would be manifested in the absence of normative debates about how an authority can be legitimized. People would no longer care. People would have other preferences. People would like to be entertained or whatever. They would no longer contest the legitimacy of their government. We find lots of signs of democratic fatigue. People no longer participate in elections and so forth. We also find an important strand in political science literature that defines this idea of post-democracy as democratic fatigue. I think it is underlying the account of Colin Crouch, also underlying the account of Peter Mayer. But we can ask ourselves how convincing it is, because there is clearly no absence of democratic mobilization, and the question of legitimacy of government and of the exercise of power still matters to a lot of people. The third scenario here is what I call democratic backsliding, and this is when we find leaders who are in a powerful position, who have taken government, and who gradually erode democratic principles. So this is a strategic attempt to undermine democracy by those who hold power, by those who are also legitimately elected as leaders, and then to decide a kind of authoritarian turn by changing the constitution, by claiming more and more rights for the executive. These are the cases we discuss in Europe, for instance, of Hungary, and what we call illiberal democracy. So these are the three scenarios, but note here that only the first scenario actually claims that there is really an alternative to democracy. The other two scenarios do not have any alternative foundation of a legitimacy of political authority. So keep this in mind when we discuss post-democracy. Now, what I told you before is that we need to think of values always as something that is contested. And we need to talk about conflicts of values. And here it certainly makes a difference when we talk about value conflicts over democracy. So these are conflicts where the very principles of democracy are contested. If I say, for instance, that individual liberty is no longer a value that should guide us. And we have value conflicts framed as conflicts within democracy. This is when I have different interpretations of how I interpret individual liberties and how individual liberties should be translated into particular policies to support individual freedoms. And this is also important to distinguish, because I would guess that the majority of conflicts about values that we witness today remain values within democracy, not values over democracy. So even Putin does not claim that, for instance, democratic elections should be abolished. So democratic backsliding then is a form of regression. I said this before. It's an idea that we return to a past, that we go back in time, that we, from a higher kind of development to a lower state, from a higher status of protection of rights to a lower status of protection of rights. And this idea of progression and regression, I think, is also problematic in many senses. It is problematic because the very idea of value progression can be also understood as being rather Eurocentric, which questions the very idea of a European community of values, this universalistic understanding of values as expanding, as underlying modernization, as defining higher higher states of social and political development. That this is a very Eurocentric idea. Also, this is something we can discuss. I can give you maybe some insights here. That many people indeed, this is, for instance, from a post-colonial perspective, they would claim that the idea of a European community of values represents a Eurocentric theory of modernity, that it stands in this tradition. That the idea of value progression, which is underlying our democratic constitutionalism, very much reflects our Western perspective. It has a tradition in Europe also. It unfolded mainly within Europe. It applies certainly to the European Union, but not necessarily to other parts of the world. It goes back to the tradition of the French Revolution in combination with the American Revolution, which also unites us, historically speaking, with the US. So it reflects from that perspective a particular constitutional understanding, constitutional norms and standards that then, of course, were copied in other parts of the world, but the origin remains a European, and precisely for this can be questions to what extent they apply to other parts of the world. So, do all people in the world think that elections are to be held in democracy? Do all people in the world think that democracy is the best form of government? Do all cultures in the world agree with the way we define fairness, justice, and individual liberties? Or is this a Western imposition? Did we in Europe and also in the EU and also in the European Union unduly universalize this historical, our legacy of constitutionalism with reference to the French and American Revolution? Well, the response that is given in political theory says no, precisely because there is this open, democratic, open, universalistic understanding. So it is not meant to define values in substantive terms, but only in procedural terms. We define procedures for other cultures to agree on what kind of political order they want to establish. And for these procedures to work, we need to make a reference to these basic rights. This is the kind of universalistic response to the critique of Eurocentrism. But still, of course, you can claim that also this idea remains remains Eurocentric. So this is something that I will leave open to the debate. And it is a debate that is also useful if we actually want to mobilize in defense of these values. So it is a question whether we, from our Western perspective, can, for instance, criticize human rights violations in other parts of the world. If we, from a Western feminism perspective, can criticize violation of equality rights in other countries, for instance. So it is a very kind of relevant question also for those of you who define themselves as political activists. But maybe we can come back to this later in the debate. So what I want to do then at the end, in the last 5 minutes, is to talk about value conflicts that we witness in contemporary Europe. And I talked to you before that value conflicts is not something to be considered as exceptional. It is something that belongs to the way we define and also how we institutionalize values. This underlying the very idea of our competitive party system that we contest the meaning of democratic values. So my conclusion here then would be that this key question, whether we witness democratic backsliding in the European Union, is actually part of a progressive understanding of European values. So it is a manifestation of enhanced value conflicts when we talk about democratic backsliding. So from that perspective, we can de-dramatize what we witness today in terms of post-democracy and democratic backsliding. And the European Union in the present days is actually doing two things. The EU is still in the process of exporting the values that are kind of underlying its treaties. It does so through the enlargement processes. So the European Union still claims to consolidate democratic values. But then at the same time, while the EU is doing this, or maybe also because it is doing this, these values become increasingly contested. So the EU is increasingly being called into question for its defense of values, and the former consensus of values is increasingly contested, both internally and externally. So there is an expectation of a consolidated consensus about what are our core values, and precisely for this there is also enhanced contestation of values within the member states of the EU, within our democracies, and also externally. We can ask then, what is the nature of these conflicts? Do they pose any existential threat to democracy? Some would claim that they do. Or do these conflicts simply belong to democracy? That would be my conviction. Maybe these conflicts even point at a new stage of Europeanization and transnationalization of democracy, which Europe can be the motor, which can be promoted by Europe. So I have three manifestations of enhanced value conflicts here that I would like to point out. The first is that democratic values are contested domestically within established democracies. And this is what most empirical observations are about when we talk about value conflicts, for instance, on how they are enhanced by social media, by political debates on social media, that we witness polarization, radicalization, also fragmentation, that democratic regression takes place within the democratic nation states, and as such it can be described than through indicators which I mentioned before: decline of vote, rise of populist parties, independence of the judiciary that is undermined, freedom of the press that is undermined, and so forth. This is something we have also studied in our project. I can come a bit further examples for this if you like in the discussion. The second manifestation of enhanced value conflicts that we witness in contemporary Europe are the contestations of democratic values at the European level, which means between EU member states. So while the EU is establishing and also promoting a common set of European values, particular member states kind of contest these values and clash over the interpretation of these core values. And this is what we have witnessed in particular with Hungary, some years before also with Poland, where, for instance, we witness conflicts over the freedom of expression, conflicts over the rule of law, conflicts over gender equality. So these conflicts are increasingly dividing the EU, and we can ask how such divisions are manifested and what will be future scenarios. What do they mean for this very idea of promoting a European community of values if we have these conflicts at an interstate level? And the third manifestations of value conflicts in contemporary Europe is the most recent one, certainly, and probably also the most topical ones, if we think of the possible future, which is this militarization of values in international relations. And what we observe here is that not only between European member states, but also at the international level, we face this increasing conflicts about values, which has to do with the collapse of what is called normative internationalism, the decline of the supremacy of the West. And this is also a major rupture with the past, where we could still defend this idea of value universalism that also was a driver of stability and peace in many ways. And these conflicts now are returning to the center of Europe, and they are dividing the West. And I think this will lead to a very fundamental rethinking of European unification, which for a long time was forward-looking with this agenda of expansive values. And we increasingly start to look at the past now, if we think of the Western community of values. And by promoting democratic values, we ensure that we will never need to enter war. This was also one of the credos of the Cold War. And in the face of confrontation with non-democratic regimes and the decline of Western universalism, what Europe is experiencing is just the opposite. So the promotion of democratic values might actually trigger quite violent responses, and we are confronted with the war scenario by defending these values, and this is a likely future scenario. And this is what I call here the militarization of conflicts about core democratic values. And I don't think this is the same that Huntington had in mind when he talked about the clashes of civilization 30 years ago. What we witness here is different. The new militarization is not necessarily expressed as a form of clash of different regimes of values, but it is rather taking shape kind of internally, and it questions the readiness of Western governments also to invest in the military for the defense of democratic values, to invest in security against these perceived external enemies, also internal enemies. And the promotion of democracy in the past was meant as a strategy of intervention of Europe in other parts of the world to secure then stability and peace in these parts of the world. And what we observe today is militarization that responds to a perceived negative impact of interventions of non-democratic regimes in our democracies. So, for instance, Russia, disinformation, conspiracies, what is called hybrid security threats. And these hybrid security threats also imply a major rethinking of security and securitization. And this is part of the kind of military responses that our governments try to define in these days. And so there is a return of a Cold War logic that at the same time does no longer apply. And this, I think, implies a major rethinking. And of course, now what we also witness is that there is no longer a unitary position of NATO in defending. NATO was meant for the defense of democratic values, and this unitary position does no longer exist. And also this will be a major challenge, how we will redefine our community, our so-called community of values. And here the debate about post-democracy also will come back because we will witness these new salience of value contestation in international relations, in international politics, and the value community might become a militant democracy. So a democracy of values might become increasingly militant in its attempts to defend values. And we can discuss whether we want this or not. So thank you.
So thank you, Professor Trenz, for this very stimulating presentation. So we got a full house today, and I imagine a lot of questions from the floor. So, any curiosity? Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Trenz. This was a truly interesting and insightful presentation. And I have many, many sparse ideas and thoughts, so I hope I will be clear in expressing them. First, on one of the introductory premises you made in the first part of the presentation, you said, in a way, the alleged European values, so the values, for example, EU promotes in its own treaties, are built to be or expressed to be forward-looking, right? But from another perspective, we could say that these values are built precisely looking at the past, in the sense that they are built in opposition to past experiences. For example, liberal democracy in opposition to 20th century totalitarian experiences. So this is my first idea, and I wonder what do you think about it? And the second aspect I was just thinking about, I don't have any clear argument. I was just reacting to your interesting arguments. This final idea of, if I interpret it correctly, contestation produces Europeanization and democratization in a way, right? So contestation is not a threat to democracy in itself. Contesting Europe, if we extend the argument, is not a threat to EU integration in itself, but because from one perspective, it produces debate, it makes, Europe meaningful. But what I wonder is, this argument cannot or can it be extended to societies and polities in general? What I'm trying to say is that this argument, I think, that's what I think right now, contestation produces democratization, community building in a way only within democracies, right? But what I wonder is, can this argument be universalized and applied to other non-European contexts, for example? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with this one. I mean, these two questions, actually.
Yes.
What do you think?
First, these references to the past, of course, have been important as an underlying idea of European integration from the very beginning, but it was the idea to overcome the past. So the past was looked at in negative terms. It is the past of aggressive nationalism, it is the past of war, and it is the past of authoritarianism. So from that perspective, looking at the past provided a template of trauma. It was a traumatic experience of war that Europeans, also individually, families went through, and the European unification was meant as a future-looking process to overcome this past. So that is the kind of relevance to the past as a negative experience, and the promotion of shared values as a common project that was future-looking. So I think this is a kind of line that can be drawn here. And the idea that value contestation is future-looking and promoting democratic values, and from that perspective, expansive. How does this work? Well, it is a kind of mechanism of critique. So it is the practice to be critical. To be critical, you need a template. You need a normative template. So the idea of European values, as they are defined also here in the treaties, is to provide a normative template of critique. And this is a critique that addresses democracies, institutions, rulers, government to be not democratic enough, to not promote these values in the way there is a potential to promote them. So they are not kind of complying with the full potential how these values can be promoted. So from that perspective, there is this expansive logic that is inbuilt in a critical mechanism. So it's a normative template that facilitates critique. You can ask whether this only applies within established democracies or whether it also applies in international relations. That is more tricky, I agree. It is certainly very tricky if a democracy confronts a non-democratic regime. It might be easier between democracies. So we have many examples also of criticism within the so-called community of democratic nation states. But of course, in these cases, procedures are not established. There is no kind of public sphere of criticism for critical discourse that unites kind of institutions and electorates in such a situation. So I agree with you that the context conditions in this case are not given.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Actually, thank you first, Professor, for coming here to give us attractive and also profound lecture. Actually, I don't want to raise any question. It's just some idea I want to put here might intrigue some thoughts. So first of all, I think the most controversial thing you talked about just now is the democracy the Eurocentric value or is it universal? Because I come from a different background. I think it's more interesting and meaningful for me to talk about. So I think to clarify this issue, we have to think from two aspects. Firstly, I think from the side of nationalism, especially the nationalism in other cultural background, they might hold that it's a European value of democracy is like the external threat. It's like the external threat to pose on their own cultural background. So to check this idea, we have to think very deeply into this question. Is it unique? The value is unique only in the context of Europe, or is it universal hold opinion or value? And also we should think very carefully about the question is, especially in non-European cultures, what is a way to promote democracy? Is it a coup or military intervention, or is it like promotion of ideas or through efficient economy trade? I think the ways would result in different consequences. And from another aspect of Eurocentral view of democracy, we have to figure out the nature of European value. We have to think very carefully about the core of this concept. I think we should ask ourselves, is universal value the individualism, equality between women and men, gender equality, and also the freedom of speech? We have to think like the core of this concept from different backgrounds. So there is no conclusion. I just posed a question here. And the second thing, because I come from a different background, and really when I study the European integration, it reminds me of the history happened before Qing dynasty in China. It's pre-Qing dynasty. Maybe little people know that. So China is not always like the highly centralization of power all the time. Before Qing dynasty, 2,000 years ago, in pre-Qing dynasty, there are different kingdoms of different ethnicity in China, includes Han, Qi, Lu, Zhao. They are like different countries in Europe now. So the way for Chinese is to establish a centralized government, Qing dynasty, to control all the different kingdoms, to utilize the power, and then it ends a war. So European Union, for me, is like the unprecedented new idea. So is there a way to end the war internally or end the conflict internally that never, in human history, we never found a way. So European Union for me is like the new thing that tries to explore, discover the new way to balance all the power, to integralize all the different kingdoms in my eyes. Thank you.
Thanks. It's good that you raise this issue of Eurocentrism, because it is indeed underlying most of our concepts that we are using here. So, for instance, we talk of democratic backsliding. We cannot talk of democratic backsliding if we assume that democracy is a Eurocentric notion, because assuming that there is democratic backsliding, we underlie particular standards. And if we distinguish between progressive and regressive politics, or as we do in social movement studies, between progressive social movements and regressive social movements, we make explicit reference to such a Eurocentric notion of progression and regression. Your remarks on China are actually very European, because you emphasized encounters, the way cultures encounter, learn from encounters, enter a dialogue. All these are European ideas, to enter into a dialogue between the cultures, to learn from an encounter of cultures. The very idea of learning is European, because learning implies progress, that there is also a form of collective learning, that you can internalize values, learn about how to make them, how to defend them. Yeah? So it shows how our ways of political thinking are already kind of shaped by these very European ideas. Yeah? I don't think that in China you were able to talk, for instance, about the value of cultural encounters 200 years ago, yeah? Or about the value of entering a dialogue with other cultures. Yeah? So keep this in mind when you talk about Eurocentrism, that we already live in a world that is heavily kind of marked by these very ideas. That we cannot even enter a conversation about this without, for instance, assuming that our dialogue makes sense. Yeah?
Professor Tim Bakel.
Yeah, thank you, Hans-Jörg, and thank you for the very inspiring talk. I want to pick up the last contribution in the question, because your answer was, these are European values, like learning from each other, and it is true that these are typical for the development of Europe, maybe in the last 60 or 70 years. But how do we understand it's being typical? Yeah, I understand it as being typical. A car, it's typical for a car to have a wheel, but also it can be typical for a train to have a wheel, or for a bicycle. So there is always this lingual difficulty if you say it's a European value, that somehow one might think maybe in other cultures it's not a value to be progressive or to be understanding each other. So this would be one remark. Then I have two questions. Why do you use the concept of post-democracy prominently in the first third or so? You could use autocracy. You could autocracy, yeah, instead of post-democracy, because from Colin Crouch you have this idea that post-democracies are capitalist and neoliberal and so on. So it's hard to get rid of these connotations if you use the term. Thank you.
Yeah. With regard to my use of the term post-democracy, I was actually critical. So my attempt was rather to critically reconstruct the debate about post-democracy, and I agree with you that the term is not useful. And I was trying to point this out, that there is a little evidence for a regime that is actually post-democratic. What Colin Crouch and others describe is democratic fatigue or democratic backsliding. It's easy to find evidence for this. But what we do not find is an authority, a political authority that claims legitimacy without reference to core principles of popular sovereignty. This does not exist in the world, maybe with the exception of Iran. I'm not sure about Iran. It's the only case that comes to my mind. If you talk of autocracy, that is possible in procedural terms to describe a different way of exercising power that clearly violates democratic principles. But an autocracy has not resolved the problem of legitimacy. An autocracy needs to legitimize. That's something we know from Max Weber, that any form of exercise of political power needs legitimation. An autocracy needs to have an alternative base of legitimacy. All the autocracies I observe in the contemporary world did not resolve this issue. In the Ancien Regime, the alternative was reference to God. So authority was delegated from God. This is a clear alternative that works. But it does not work in the contemporary world, maybe with the exception of Iran. So give me any other example of a political regime that has resolved this issue. I don't know it. But you are right, on the other hand, that autocracy is a term that is preferable to post-democracy. Even worse is the term illiberal democracy, by the way. And your first point was again...
what is typical of Europe?
Yes.
which says, if I understood you right, you made a statement which said, well, if you look at China, you have these very similar principles which have worked in integrating China. And you could use the same argument for European integration. And I wonder if it would be valuable to go back to the theories of European integration, for example, Karl Deutsch or Haas, because they were talking about values, but they thought, well, values is not only ideas, it's also to do things. You have a practical element to create loyalty, to create cohesion, to create integration.
Yeah, that goes deep into a history of political ideas. And to answer to the question, what is typical with regard to what we define, or what I have introduced here as European values, what you find also established in the treaties of the European Union, what is typical European here is, if you go back in history, the experience of European modernity. So these are values that were used to define a new political and societal order, and the historical moments for this are the French and the American Revolution. What is also typical with these values, and this was already inherent in the French Revolution, is that they claimed universal validity. So the typical European moment is the way to claim universal validity of these values. And this explains also their particular success, also with European powers and with European colonialism. They were exported to the world, and as a matter of fact, they claim validity now at a global level. The question is, does this mean that they are universally valid? And here we re-enter the debate on Eurocentrism.
So first of all, thank you for these precious lessons. I would like to understand better if this change in democratic values is linked to maybe the populism. Is there a causal correlation between them? So was this changes values caused by proliferation of populist party, or maybe vice versa, or maybe there is no correlation?
Yes, there certainly is a correlation between the way democratic values are contested today and the emergence of populist parties. And the way this is done is rather complex, because populist parties do not outright challenge these values. They rather have a rather ambivalent relationship to them. So it means that, for instance, with regard to freedom of expression, it can be used as a reference for populist mobilization. For instance, as we observed this during the pandemic, that our rights of freedom of expressions are violated. As we observe this also now, with regard to the mobilization against fact-checking on social media, which is run by populist parties, that this is a violation of our rights of freedom of expression. On the other hand, the populists will also challenge, for instance, gender equality, how this is defined in progressive terms. So populists move all the time between progressive mobilization, like defense of freedom of expression, and regressive mobilization, like rejection of gender equality standards. And they are certainly a part of what I defined here as enhanced value contestation.
Wonderful. So I take the opportunity also to ask a question, because it is very much related to what you were asking. So in the face of this rise in success also of especially right-wing populist parties, so what is the role, what is the special contribution of left-wing parties to actually uphold these values. So something that they haven't been doing. Have you got anything to point out on these?
Yeah, this question requires some clarification in the first place, because it assumes that regressive is right populist and progressive is left politics, which is to some extent there's evidence for this, but it disregards the role of liberal parties here, and also the role of liberal democracy and the defense of liberal democracy, which can be attacked by both the right and the left. So this makes the question a little bit more tricky. And with regard to the role of left, let's call them left progressive parties, I have no problem with this term. What we observe is that they have lost electorates in very substantial ways. Not only in Italy, where there is basically no left party in the parliament, but also in most other member states of the EU. And this, in parallel with the success of right populist and right extremist parties, which are close to taking government or have already taken government in most EU member states. So this puts the left parties in a very defensive position, and the question is whether the populist backlash and also the attack of populist parties on core fundamental values is an opportunity for left parties to regain voters. One could, for instance, assume that massive attacks against gender equality would mobilize electorates, not only women, but hopefully also men in defense of rights of gender equality. The problem is that what we would expect, so far we lack evidence for it.
First of all, thank you for being here. I was wondering, still related to this part of the discourse, well, right-wing parties often refer to religious values, and of course, religion has its own values and such an influence on society. So I was wondering, what do you think the role of religion is on this kind of progression or regression? Thank you.
Yes, if you define progressive values, they are meant to be secular values. Also, modernization was meant to be secular, which means that religious values are defined as pre-modern values. As such, in a liberal regime, they are allowed to be exercised, religion, but they are not kind of informing our constitutions, at least not in the way we define the value base of our democracies. So we do not say that our democracies are based on Christian values, or at least if the political parties who make such a claim are heavily contested. Yeah? So from that perspective, we could expect that religious movements today play a part in the way democratic values are contested, and religion is used as a reference, for instance, by the radical right. It is also often used as a reference by populist parties. But this is not done in a consistent way that they would define themselves as a kind of religious movement. So the reference to religion remains maybe useful strategically, but it is loose. So I would say that religion has lost the mobilizing power here. It can certainly mobilize some electorates, but you would not win an election by claiming that you are defending the Christian community of values, for instance. I don't think this is viable.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I would like to discuss one idea that you put forward, that was that even though we have a lot of autocracies, no autocracy besides theocracies can legitimize their power without popular sovereignty. So, for example, if you look at Belarus, if you look at Russia, they all have some sort of elections. And here I think the implication is that this is some sort of win for democracy, for democratic values. So even autocracies need to put this democratic makeup on to legitimize. So there's here two implications that I would like to contest. First of all is that they cannot legitimize themselves without popular sovereignty. I think they can, and they do. It's about this idea of a strong man, this idea of having the abilities to govern the country with strength. For example, I'm from Portugal, and we had a dictatorship, a very long dictatorship, and the idea, even though we also had elections, the idea was that the dictatorship saved our finances, that he was very good with the economy and stuff like that. So the legitimacy of those leaders comes from more ability than actual popular sovereignty. And the second idea that I would like to contest is that this is some sort of win to democracy. I think it's actually the opposite. So this makes the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea of democracy, more and more vague. So just because we have this minimalist approach to democracy, that democracy is when we have elections, that is democratic. I think we need to go exactly the other way around. We need to have more and more, how do I say the word? Democracy needs more stuff than elections. It needs deliberative democracy. It needs more participation from the public, and it's more material stuff. So I just know, how do you respond to this?
Yes, thanks for these examples, and I do not have an exact response to this. So I think you are right in saying that an autocracy that claims popular sovereignty is stable to some extent and can survive for quite a long period, and even claim legitimately that popular sovereignty is represented. Like Putin would do this by claiming that he represents the Russian soul, for instance. It's this kind of ethno-nationalist reference. The case of Portugal as a dictatorship is more complicated because this was almost a pre-modern dictatorship, but still also the Salazar regime relied on some notion of popular sovereignty, and you also had elections during Salazar. So even Salazar did not fully give up the reference to popular sovereignty. He certainly had a strong grounding in religion, for instance, with reference to the Catholic Church, but this was not his unique source of legitimacy as an autocratic leader. So what you can see here is that these regimes can certainly establish, can claim legitimacy for some time. I cannot predict for how long. I would assume that they remain internally unstable because the legitimacy base can always be questioned. So they are not immune to critique precisely because they need to rely on some relic notion of popular sovereignty, which means that they also need to accept that the people at some point can protest and resist. So with regard to Russia, my prediction would be that the Russian regime looks pretty stable for the time being, but it has certainly not resolved all its internal contradictions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for the presentation. Do you think a Russian victory in Ukraine would accelerate the decline of democracy on a global scale? And how would it affect the European values and our democracy? Would it make us stronger or maybe weaken us? Fast question.
Yes. Well, the problem is that Europe, for the time being, does not play a big role in negotiating the peace between Russia and Ukraine. And the procedure that has been put in place now is highly questionable, especially from what we call a European perspective on values, because it violates basic principles of fairness, for instance, of sustainable peace. So I think Europe lost the battle here, first and foremost, and it needs to redefine itself. I do not want to be in a position to be a European leader in this situation. We have seen rather desperate attempts now of Europe still playing a role here and finding its way back at the negotiating table or formulating alternative proposals here. But this is not viable without the US and without Russia. And the US and Russia have opted for a different path here of so-called peace finding. So first and foremost, I would say that that Europe lost an important opportunity here. Maybe it should have stepped forward as a peacemaker before Trump entered the government. Maybe even at the very beginning of this war, there was an opportunity for this, but Europe did not take it and opted for the continuation of the war, probably for too long.
Thank you, Professor, for the beautiful presentation. I see that all the audience is very interesting. And I'm very curious about the post-democratization thing, since I want to link to the Professor Tim Buchel. I want to ask specifically, since nowadays the citizens have really strong power in power accountability. And in this reason, I understand the first point of shift to new order of politics, of new order of maintain the power. And secondly, I understand also the fatigue of democracy values, since I understand also that the people become lazy and also apathic in terms of democracy, since also the shift to digital transformation and social tools, for example. So this link to the third point, backline of democracy. So I want to understand better this point, since it's very dangerous when the power start to control, manipulate, and how the citizen do critics and in general this sentence. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I don't know exactly what I should respond to this. I basically agree, yes. Or was there a question?
I want to understand better digital tools, how provocate the manipulation of this increase of this.
Okay. Yeah.
The role of social media, let's say, in undermining our democracies. But this is, I don't know if you want to enter these.
Yeah, that is unfortunately a pro-debate, which I'm not exactly sure whether we have the time now. I was referring to this with reference to the problems of finding indicators here. So if you talk of democratic backsliding and of democratic success, what would be indicators for democratic success and what would be indicators for democratic backsliding? And my impression is that it is easier to find indicators for democratic backsliding than indicators for democratic success. And one of the key indicators that are used for democratic backsliding is indeed media, media freedom, media independence, and also qualitative studies on how political debates unfold on media and have detrimental effects for how people, for instance, form public opinion, for how people support values, for how people take positions in conflict, for how people might potentially radicalize or polarize into opposing communities who see themselves as enemies.
Fantastic. We have a last question.
Thank you. Well, my question is addressed more to the sociologist of social movements or culture, I think. But today in Tbilisi, in Georgia, there is a demonstration of women who are claiming rights, for civil rights, equality, of course, and they have a flag of the European Union in their hands. Some months ago, during the Moldovan political elections, 2,500,000 Moldovians of the diaspora mobilized and voted for the president who was pro-European against Moldovan living in the country and who are a minority. They are less than, I think, 1,500,000. So European values are still attractive outside Europe. I mean, they are less contested outside Europe, maybe. I don't know, because, you are right. We are always more focused on the failures of democracies, of European democracies in implementing European values. And maybe we are less focused on the success they have. But maybe you can also give us, because you also have an attention to social movements, what's happening in civil society. So how can we capitalize this thing that European values are attractive? Even people coming from Africa, from Asia, they come to Europe because they have an idea of, what are the prevailing rules coming from European values. Freedom, the rule of law, they have this idea, and maybe well-being, tolerance. So, what do you think? Thank you.
No, I have no doubts about this, that European values are attractive and drive political mobilizations in many parts of the world. I would not call these European values here maybe, but these are the values of democracy that Europe stands for. and that Europe also defends in these other parts of the world. So if I would be a Moldovan, I would also be a very strong defender of European values living in Moldova. There's no doubt about this. So this attraction of what we call the basic democratic values drives political mobilizations, not only in neighboring countries of the EU, also in the Mediterranean. You could interpret, for instance, the Arabic Spring as an expression of resurgence of democratic values, with explicit references also to Europe. So I have no doubts about this, and it might be also the case that you find a stronger support for the idea of defense of these values in countries that recently experienced authoritarian regimes, like in Eastern Europe, than here in Italy, maybe. Yeah? So I'm not excluding this.
Okay, I think we need to conclude. So please join me in thanking Professor Trenz. So this was a very thought-provoking seminar, and it took us really to the core of the ValEUs Lecture series, but there will be more. So until the next time, bye-bye.